Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. I am genuinely excited about today's story because it sits right at the intersection of hardware, capital, and the looming inference bottleneck nobody can stop talking about.
So the headline from yesterday, May 13th, 2026, is that a London startup called Fractile just closed a $220 million Series B round to build a radically new kind of AI inference chip.
And to be clear for everyone listening, this is not a sleepy enterprise raise. The lead investors are Accel, Factorial Funds, and Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, with Felicis, Conviction, Gigascale, and 8VC also writing checks.
That is an absolutely loaded cap table for a 4-year-old company that has not even taped out a commercial chip yet. The first production silicon is not expected to be available to customers until 2027.
Right, and yet the signal those investors are sending could not be louder. They are essentially saying the next big problem in AI is not training the models, it is running them economically at frontier scale.
Let's slow down on that point because I think it is the whole story. For most of the last few years, the obsession in this industry was training cost, training compute, and how to get the next big model off the ground.
Exactly, and that obsession produced an entire economy around H100s, B200s, and now whatever NVIDIA is shipping next quarter. Training scaled, inference quietly became the thing that actually costs money at runtime.
And reasoning models broke whatever was left of the old economics because when a single user query can chew through millions of tokens of internal thought, the per query cost stops looking like rounding error and starts looking like an actual product margin problem.
That is the wedge Fractile is driving into. Their bet is that inference is now its own category, with its own bottleneck, and you cannot keep solving it by stacking more general-purpose training accelerators on top of each other.
So tell me about the architecture, because the phrase the company keeps using is in-memory compute, and I want to make sure listeners understand why that is genuinely different from a GPU and not just marketing language.
Sure, so the basic problem with a GPU running inference is that the model weights live in external high-bandwidth memory. And on every single forward pass, you have to shuttle those weights across a narrow electrical bridge into the compute units.
And that shuttling is where most of the energy and most of the time actually goes, which is a wild thing to realize because the matrix multiplication itself, the math, is comparatively cheap on modern silicon.
Precisely. Fractile says it executes 99.99% of inference operations inside on chip SRAM cells. So the model weights essentially live next to the multipliers, and almost no data shuttling happens at all.
That is the part that makes this an architectural bet rather than an incremental one. They are not optimizing the existing pipeline. They are removing one of the two main components of the existing pipeline entirely.
And the performance claims that fall out of that are pretty striking. Fractal is publicly saying 25 times faster frontier model inference at 1/10 the cost, with throughput numbers as high as 1,200 tokens per second.
I'm going to play a small dose of skeptic there, because every silicon startup in history has shown beautiful simulated numbers at the funding stage and then run into very ugly reality once actual chips come back from the foundry.
That is a completely fair pushback, and I would actually frame the right metric a little differently. The number that matters in this category is not raw speed, it is watts per useful token at deployment scale.
Watts per useful token is such a quietly important phrase because it bakes in the energy story, the data center cost story, and the unit economics of every AI product all in one ratio.
And it is the metric that hyperscalers actually optimize for behind closed doors. If Fractile can deliver something even half as good as their public claim on that ratio, every inference-heavy product team in the industry will want to look.
Speaking of which, there is a really juicy adjacent story here, which is that Anthropic is reportedly in early talks to buy chips from Fractile, according to reporting from Tom's Hardware and other outlets this week.
That is the kind of signal that turns a speculative architecture into a credible procurement option. If a frontier lab is willing to entertain DRAM-less inference silicon from a UK startup, it tells you the GPU constraint is biting hard.
It also tells you something about how the frontier labs are thinking about supply diversification. Because the same week Anthropic was rumored to be talking to Fractal, you have OpenAI doing custom chip work and Meta still pouring money into MTIA.
Everyone at the top of the stack is quietly hedging away from a single supplier. Whether that supplier is NVIDIA or anyone else, the lesson from 2024 through 2026 is that concentration risk is real and expensive.
Let's pull on the founder thread for a minute, because Fractile is interesting partly because of who is running it. Walter Goodwin started this company in 2022 while he was a PhD student at the Oxford Robotics Institute.
Oxford Robotics is not a place most people would predict as the launching pad for a frontier inference chip startup. But the connection actually makes sense if you think about robotics as the original real-time inference problem.
That is a good frame because robotics has always lived under tight latency and power budgets, and a researcher who grew up in that environment is going to view inference cost very differently than someone who grew up in cloud training.
Right, and you can see that perspective reflected in their technical choices. Back in October 2024, they licensed a RISC V-vector processor from Andes Technology, which is itself a quiet but interesting decision.
RISC-V is the open instruction set architecture that has slowly become the favorite of basically every startup that does not want to pay ARM royalties or be at the mercy of a competing chip vendor's roadmap forever.
Combine that with their own custom and memory compute fabric, and you get a chip where almost nothing inside it is a black box licensed from a hyperscaler. That sovereignty story matters more in 2026 than it did even a year ago.
Which brings us neatly to the UK government angle, because the AI minister Kanishka Narayan personally weighed in yesterday and called the Fractile round a strong vote of confidence in British AI.
That kind of ministerial statement is rare, and it is not accidental. The UK has spent the last 18 months trying to convince the world that it still has a credible seat at the AI infrastructure table after the EU IAC drama.
And until now, most of the British AI story has been about safety institutes, research labs, and the AI Safety Summit afterglow, rather than actual silicon. Fractile is potentially the first real UK hardware champion in this cycle.
Which is why the round attracted both classic Silicon Valley money like Founders Fund and Accel, and also a deliberately European feel with Factorial Funds leading alongside them. That mix is unusual, and it signals strategic intent.
Let's zoom out for a second, because yesterday was actually a wild day for AI infrastructure capital in a much broader sense. The same day, Fractile closed $220 million, and Durrell announced a $5 billion Series H.
At a $61 billion valuation, no less, which essentially doubles where Anduril sat less than a year ago. Defense tech and inference hardware are now both being treated as core AI infrastructure plays.
And I think that pairing actually says something about where the market is. The bet is no longer on better models in isolation. It is on the entire physical stack that makes those models useful in the real world.
Right, you need chips that can run inference cheaply, you need defense and security applications that justify the capital, and you need supply chains that do not run entirely through one foundry in Taiwan and one set of GPUs in California.
Let's talk about the risks, though, because I do not want to leave listeners with the impression this is a sure thing. Fractile is a hardware startup, and hardware startups have a brutal history of slipping schedules and missing performance targets.
Completely fair. 2027 for first commercial chip availability is a long runway in AI time, and a lot can shift between now and then. NVIDIA's roadmap alone could move the goalpost twice before Fractile's silicon arrives.
There's also the software stack problem, which kills more chip startups than the chips themselves do. Every frontier model team has tooling, kernels, and compilers tuned for CUDA. And walking away from that is genuinely painful.
That is the part that does not get enough attention. Even if Fractile's silicon hits its targets, they still need a compiler stack, a runtime, and a developer experience that does not feel like a regression from what teams already have.
And without that software story, you can have the world's most efficient inference chip and still watch customers shrug and stay on GPUs because the switching cost is too painful and the tooling immaturity is too risky.
This is exactly where the $220 million matters in a non-obvious way. A lot of that capital is not going to silicon at all. It is going to compilers, tooling, and the people who write them.
Which is also part of why Founders Fund and Accel are good investors for this kind of bet. Because they have seen this movie before with companies like Cerebras and Grok, and they know hardware alone never wins inference.
That comparison to Grok and Cerebras is the right one. Both companies had genuinely interesting architectures. Both raised large rounds, and both are still in the trench fight of turning architectural advantages into durable commercial pipelines.
So if we step back and ask what listeners should actually take away from the Fractile round, I think it is three things. First, inference economics are now openly broken at the frontier, and everyone knows it.
Second, in-memory compute and SRAM-heavy architectures have moved from academic curiosity to fundable category. With serious frontier customers willing to at least take meetings, that is a meaningful inflection in how this layer is perceived.
And third, The geography of AI infrastructure is quietly diversifying. We have China pursuing sovereignty with Huawei and DeepSeek, the US still at the center, and now a credible UK player with capital, talent, and government attention behind it.
I would add a fourth angle that I find personally fascinating, which is that we may be watching the first real signs of a post-GPU era in inference specifically, not in training, but at the deployment edge.
That is a big claim, though, so let me push back gently. Post-GPU does not mean GPUs disappear. It just means inference workloads start migrating to purpose-built silicon, while training stays on the most general accelerator available.
Yes, that is the more accurate framing. Think of it as a workload split rather than a replacement, similar to what happened with networking ASICs versus CPUs in the data center a decade and a half ago.
And if you are an investor or an operator listening to this, the signals to watch over the next 12 months are pretty clear. First, does Fractile actually announce a confirmed customer beyond the Anthropic rumor?
Second, do their tape out and yield milestones land roughly on schedule? Because every quarter of slip in this category is essentially a quarter of free runway for the incumbents to close the gap.
Third, does the UK government back this story with something more than a press release? Because real industrial policy support around compute, energy access, and procurement would meaningfully change the odds for any domestic chip player.
And fourth, watch how the watts per useful token metric starts showing up in hyperscaler earnings calls and product announcements. Because once that number becomes a published KPI, the entire industry conversation pivots overnight.
This was a really fun one to dig into, and honestly, the fact that it landed on the same day as the Anduril round makes it feel like a small but distinct moment in the AI infrastructure narrative for 2026.
Completely agreed. A British inference chip startup catching the attention of Anthropic and Peter Thiel on the same day American defense tech doubles its valuation tells you the AI build-out has very much entered its physical layer phase.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and we will be right back here with you tomorrow for another deep dive into the AI ecosystem.